Hello friends, and welcome back to the Hall of Craft! I'm back with another video for you guys. So I have made these big, chunky Runehammer Inspired Terrain Boards in the past, and these things are great. They have a nice carved grid on them, they're big, they're durable, and they look good. We love Runehammer here, and he has brought a lot to the community with this idea, but I think I can add a little bit more to it and also kind of combine it with some other ideas that I've seen here on YouTube. So my big problem with these boards is that over the years and over my various apartment moves, the corners have gotten quite dinged up and the XPS foam underneath gets exposed quite easily, kind of compromising your paint job, and that's just to do with the fact that they have these really vulnerable corners to them. So I figured that one thing I could do to instantly upgrade the quality of the Runehammer boards is to kind of smush them together and combine them with Professor Dungeon Master's Ultimate Dungeon Terrain, little dungeon pizza as it's known in the community, method. I think I can kind of combine those two things to create some much nicer and much more reliable and safe boards for myself. So I think that by combining these two ideas and doing it now as the Alistair of the future, who is a much better crafter than the Alistair of the past, I think I can create myself some nice, beautiful, durable, long-lasting terrain boards. So the plan here is I'm going to create 3 boards, each roughly about 2 foot in diameter, and I'm going to make them double-sided. That way I can have 6 biomes ready to go whenever I need them. And because my channel kind of functions as an archive of crafting tutorials, I'm not going to smush all of these into one video. I'm going to give each biome its own video, and I'm going to put them in a playlist that you can find here in the top right if you're watching this after it's posted. I'm going to put them all there together so that if you need to find a certain biome at a glance, it's right there and you don't need to watch through a 40-minute video to dig for the information you're looking for. So if you want to skip this intro after watching it for the 5th time, I'll make sure that I put bars in the bottom so everything is clearly labeled. For this video, I am going to be doing the lava board. So to start out with this one, I just take a piece of string, a screw, and a Sharpie. And by placing the screw in the middle and wrapping the string around the Sharpie, I will draw a circle as big as I can on my 2 foot by 8 foot and 2 inch thick sheet of blue XPS foam. This stuff is great, you can just get it at the hardware store. And so one of the awesome things about the Runehammer terrain is that it is 2 inches thick, and this foam facilitates that. I know that some versions of the UDT or the Dungeon Pizza go a little thinner, a little bit more flat, but for this it's actually really important that we use the 2 inch thick because it'll facilitate the double-sided nature of these boards. Once that's drawn, it's time to cut. For this, I'll just cut as close to the circle as I can with a big knife, and then once I'm partially through the foam, I'll snap it over my knee. This gives me a much more manageable chunk. Once I have that chunk, I'll take it over to my Proxon and use it to cut off the corners. You could do this with a knife, it'll just take a lot more time and you'll have to be a lot more patient. I have the Proxon, so I use it here because it saves me so much and it gives me a really nice smooth cut. Now it's time to draw the grid. For this, I just use a tape measure to find the center and then a triangle to square it up. From there, you can just mark out all of the inch marks with a pen, and it's just a matter of connecting the dots from here on out. You can skip this step if you don't like playing with grids, but on these boards I find them pretty subtle in the end after all the texturizing and other elements we add to it, and personally as a DM I find the grid very helpful on the table to just see things at a quick glance. The last thing I'm going to do to all of the boards is just take a sanding block and smooth the rough edge that I cut with the Proxon. Because I'm treating these like double-sided boards, I'm treating this edge almost like the base rim on a mini, and I'd like it to be as clean as possible. Okay, now to start personalizing the lava board. To start out here, I'm just going to sketch out where I would like my pools of lava to be. I just want to add a handful of these. I don't want to make the board too specific and too unplayable. I don't want it to be like a sea of lava. I want it to be more like the inside of a volcano where there's like kind of patches of it bursting through. To help add more lava without just covering the whole thing in pools, I'm going to be cutting a bunch of channels in. So I'm just going to kind of draw out those channels all coming from the top of the board and kind of streaming and weaving out across it. So to start cutting them out, I'm going to begin with the channels, and using a nice sharp X-Acto knife, I'm going to cut along both edges of it at a 45-degree angle. This will create like a nice little groove in there that will act as a nice clean guide for what we do later on. Now for the pools, unfortunately there is no clean, easy way to do this, so make sure you have a vacuum handy. I start by cutting them a few times vertically and horizontally, carving like a little grid into them, and then using your knife, you just start scraping it all out. You don't need to go particularly deep with this. In fact, it's actually better if you don't. Just go about as deep as the knife goes on one pass. Okay, now it's time to define the grid. So for this, I'm just gonna take my knife and then cut along the lines that we marked with the Sharpie earlier. Cutting these very shallow, it doesn't need to go particularly deep into the foam. Now this footage is of one of the cuts of the grid of the different board, and as you can see, I have textured the foam pre-cutting. For the lava board, we actually do not want to do this, and it's actually better that we don't. That order of operations is very important here, because I think I have discovered a new secret technique that will get you the ultimate cracked stone texture faster than anything else I've ever done. So after the grid is cut, I'm gonna take out my heat gun, and on medium heat, I'm just gonna hit the entire surface of the board. And what this is gonna do is it's gonna melt that surface of the board a little bit, turning it from like a foam texture to more of like a hardish plastic, and it's gonna open up that grid a bit, exposing the unheated foam underneath and just making that grid very, very defined. The other great thing that it does for this board specifically is it smooths out the bottom of the pools, kind of gets rid of a lot of that gunk and tempers it a little bit for what we're gonna do later on. Now, here is where that technique comes to life. I'm going to take my board down onto the floor, and using a 25-pound dumbbell, I am going to start smashing the top of it. Now the foam receives these smashes very well because it is 2 inches thick. It is actually very important that this be 2 inches thick for this step. I have experimented with thinner foams, and this technique will not replicate on thin foam. I believe it has to do with just the way that the thickness of the foam kind of absorbs these impacts. What happens here is because we've heated up the surface of this board already and melted it, it's kind of more plasticky, like I said, and when you hit it with the dumbbell, instead of like some of the other boards, it starts cracking and opening up these big holes, big cracks in it. It actually gets these like micro fractures because we've already hit it with the heat gun, and it just kind of absorbs the impact and gets all these tiny little cracks in it. Now here's where the magic happens. I take it back to my table, and using the heat gun again on medium heat, I will hit that surface that we've already hit with the heat gun, but is now got all these tiny little micro fractures in it. You just hit that with the heat gun again, and watch what happens here. It just opens them all up and creates this amazing veined texture. I'm actually so excited about discovering this. I think it has so many versatile possibilities to be used here. But for this, it's gonna be awesome on the lava board because that can be all of this little cracked lava texture underneath the stone. Once we're done with that, it's time to add some lava texture to the pools and channels of this board. I'm gonna keep it really simple here and just fill them with hot glue. So I'm using my hot glue gun on high temp, and I have some black hot glue sticks because I ran out of the clear ones, but it actually turned out pretty good here. If anything ever peels away or the paint chips off, we'll have that black underneath and that'll work just fine. And to my surprise at this point, which I suppose I shouldn't have been that surprised about, is the hot glue coming out of the hot glue gun melts into the foam quite deeply. And so it kind of expands the channels naturally, and it deepens the pool much more. I would have preferred if it actually didn't deepen the pools, but it does, and it works out just fine because we have the 2-inch thick foam. So definitely don't use thin foam here, or else you will be very sad at this point. So I actually don't have any lava terrain up until this point to go with this board. So I am going to, at this point, just make myself a couple of little cliff faces, just out of rough chunks of offcuts from the cutting out the circles. And I'm just gonna kind of cut those into cliffs and then pour hot glue over the top of those to create like lava pouring down the sides, almost like these are like lava is kind of bursting out from underneath and then pouring down the sides of it. These will make some nice pieces of scatter terrain. And I'm doing all of this on top of parchment paper so that the hot glue will peel off easily when it's done, and it can kind of pool naturally along the bottom edges. So once that all has cooled down, I'm going to base coat this with black paint and Mod Podge. This is going to be a nice solid base coat that'll kind of hold everything together and also protect it from future use. After that base coat is dry, it is time to paint. Now, this may seem a little strange, but since this is kind of like a glowing lava board, I'm going to treat it a little bit differently than I would paint any other piece of terrain. Instead of going from dark colors to light colors, I'm going to be going a bit more from light colors to dark colors and kind of bouncing back and forth in the middle a little bit. So the first thing I'm going to do is coat this whole board with a very liberal coating of bright red. Once that's dry, I'm going to use a sponge to sponge paint some purple into the darker areas that are further away from the lava. Making sure not to overload the sponge because I don't want too much paint to be like sinking into these cracks. I just want it to be touching the surface and those raised areas. I'm also repeating all of these same steps on my lava scatter pieces. Okay, now it's time to establish that glow look. I'm going to use my airbrush here to just spray a couple coats of white ink over top of all the lava areas. I'm also totally fine if there's any overspray here. This will just help add to the kind of glowing look. Once that's all dry, I'm going to use one of these cheap handled sponges to paint bright yellow over all of that white. Next, I will mix in some orange and dab that over most of the yellow. I'm not going for 100% coverage here, but I am making sure that the areas that are still yellow are kind of in the center or like the deeper parts of the lava. Now I'm going to switch over to a chunk of sponge that I have cut with scissors, and I'm just holding that with tweezers because it'll help me kind of get in the nooks and crannies a little bit better. This chunk of sponge also has more of like a holy texture, so it gets a better pattern on the board than the other sponge I was using. I'm going to use that to add some red-orange around the edges. Then I will do the same thing with a bright red. After that's finished, I will switch to a dry brush and dry brush bright red around all of the edges of the lava to help it look like it is glowing. At this point, I felt like I took away too many of the bright colors from the pools, and they should look hotter than the channels. So I actually quickly went back and repainted those areas with all of the same steps as before, just a little bit more restraint the second time. Okay, now it's time to make this thing pop off. I grab a sponge and cut it so it's not perfectly square, and then using some black paint, I just start dabbing that all over the surface of this board. I'm okay to hit the tops of the channels here. I just don't press too hard because I don't want black sinking into the recesses. I want those recesses to stay looking hot, but pressing black over top of all of the raised areas will help it look like the air is cooling it, and it'll really give it this kind of drying rock lava look. I'm also going to use a little chunk of sponge again and add some black to the pools, specifically the edges and the bubbles. Now we arrive at what should have been the most satisfying, easy capstone step to just finish off the lava board: applying a coat of protective varnish. Now I'm not exactly sure why, but varnish for me tends to be the most fickle and coin flippy aspect of any crafting project. There's times where I put a coat of varnish on at the end and it doesn't do anything but dry clearly and look great. And those awesome. That's how it should work. And maybe if I lived in Arizona, that's how it would work every time because it's dry and hot. But because I live in Canada, I'm assuming, and it is so humid here, 50% of the time, or maybe even more, my varnish goes on and dries cloudy and just ruins the paint job. And I bet you can see where this is going because I wouldn't be complaining about it if it worked out well here. So I've looked up all kinds of tutorials about how people can save a cloudy varnish because I'm definitely not the only person who's experienced this problem. But most of the tutorials that I see usually involve like reactivating with more varnish or watering it down or making sure you apply a thinner coat next time. And none of that really has worked out well for me. So in this case, I covered the whole board with a healthy coat of matte varnish with a brush. In hindsight, probably should have done a couple thin coats with my airbrush to be safer, but I was just excited to get this through and I thought that I'd be fine here. Ultimately, the varnish dried very cloudy and had me very worried that I had ruined this board completely, specifically because that beautiful cracked texture that I had, that I was so proud of at this point. The varnish in those areas had dried really cloudy and kind of gave it this kind of washed out white look rather than the kind of like interior red glowing look that I was really happy with. I was kind of heartbroken here, but I set to work on trying to fix it, and what I ended up doing was mixing together a red ink wash with Flow Improver, matte, medium, and red ink, and just kind of wash that over all of the area and hoped that that would sink into those cracks and kind of dye them red again. And this time it actually worked. I was pretty surprised and honestly very relieved that this saved the day here. I'm not sure if it looked quite as good as it did originally, but I was happy to kind of call it a day there and count my blessings that I had a board that was still looking pretty good. All right, there we have it. Double-sided terrain boards. Thank you so much for watching. I really hope you enjoyed this video. A bit more of a simpler one than I've been doing lately, but sometimes it's nice to go back to the basics, and for me personally, it just feels good to have a nice staple in my collection that I know I can rely on. If you'd like to check out all of these other terrain board building videos, I will put a link to the playlist in the top right. I also have plenty of other terrain crafting and miniature painting videos that you can check out while you wait for the next one. Again, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video. Have a good week, everyone.